I'm Peter Mansbridge, and I'm ready to start digging deep.
I'm Mark Sutcliffe. Welcome to Digging Deep, presented by Zen Books and Abacus Data. This is the latest in our series of one-on-one conversations with thoughtful, accomplished, interesting people who come from many different fields. We talk to astronauts, Olympic champions, musicians, entrepreneurs, television hosts, and more. We explore their stories, their challenges, their defining moments. And we learn from them the powerful lessons, the hard-earned lessons that we can apply to our own lives. And we do that in a couple of parts. We start off with some rapid-fire questions and answers that allow us to get to know the guest a little bit. And then we start digging deep into their stories and life lessons. Our guest today is Peter Mansbridge. For almost 30 years, Peter Mansbridge was the face of television news in Canada as the host of the CBC's flagship nightly news program, The National. Throughout his remarkable career, Peter interviewed thousands of people from every area of life. He had a historic discussion with President Barack Obama, as one example. Now, how he entered journalism is quite a story in itself. We will discuss how he didn't finish high school and the almost mythical story of how his voice was noticed when he was announcing flights in an airport in Churchill, Manitoba. We will also talk about the role of luck in his life and his extraordinary new book, which is not about the famous people he interviewed, but everyday Canadians most people have never heard of. It's called Extraordinary Canadians. And we will get into the future of the media, which is a topic that obviously is very relevant today. This is a very interesting, informative, candid, wide-ranging conversation that I know you are going to enjoy. One last thing before we get started. If you like what you hear, then please subscribe to the podcast and post a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen, and share the podcast with your network. And if you're looking for more information about this episode of the show, including links to anything we reference in our chat, if you want to read my daily blog, where I post every single day of the year, or subscribe to my newsletter, The Weekly Dig, which has 5 very quick items that I've learned about each week, please go to our website. It's letsdigdeep.com. That's letsdigdeep.com. You can also find a link to my TEDx talk there. Now, let's start digging deep with Peter Mansbridge. All right, Peter, it is such a pleasure to welcome you to Digging Deep. I've really been looking forward to this, and I have been watching you for many, many years, as so many Canadians have, and this is the first time that I'm going to be watching you, and you're going to be watching me and hearing what I'm saying too, because usually it's a one-way conversation.
Right. Well, listen, Mark, first of all, thanks for having me on, and I'm really looking forward to this. I know your work and appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much. So let's start with some quick questions and answers, and then we'll talk a little more about your book, which is very interesting. So let's start with your fondest childhood memory. What would you say that is?
Probably my first flight. It was from Penang in what was then Malaya to Kuala Lumpur, which is in Malaya. We were moving there in the 1950s. And aviation has had an impact on me the rest of my life. So I remember that first one. I was only, 3 or 4 years old.
Wow. And you traveled a lot as a child, right?
I did. Born in England, raised in Southeast Asia. Then we moved to Canada in the mid-50s and moved around Canada quite a bit. So moving has always been a part of my life.
Who was your hero when you were 10 years old?
I think my dad, like a lot of young boys, your father becomes a hero figure, and my dad certainly was to me. He'd been in the Second World War in the RAF and had a distinguished war record, and he was my hero not only for that, but for the way he carried on his life.
What did you think you were going to be when you grew up? Because I know it wasn't television anchor.
It certainly wasn't. I wanted to be an underwater archaeologist, and that was one of my early dreams of doing underwater archaeology. But then I realized, you got to have really good grades to get into that area. and that wasn't working for me.
What is your life story in 6 words?
I've been a very lucky guy.
I like that. I have been too. What is maybe a big mistake that you've made at some point, and what did you learn from it? Something that became a lesson.
Assuming too much knowledge on any particular subject. My dad always used to say, a little knowledge is a very dangerous thing. He was right. It took me a while to realize that.
For what do you feel most grateful?
Living in Canada, it sounds corny, but we got a lot to be grateful of here. And when you talk to anybody in different parts of the world and you tell them you're Canadian, they envy your situation right away, and for good reason. We are very lucky, and we should be grateful.
What's been the best year of your life so far, and why?
I've had so many good years in terms of, exciting work and travel. But probably 1968, that's when I kind of fluked my way into CBC, and it led to this, last 50 years plus of excitement and travel and meeting people and doing interviews that I've really enjoyed. So it all started back there in 1968.
What's been the toughest year of your life so far, and why?
I guess in the early 2000s when over a couple of years I lost both my parents. And that's difficult. You don't realize it until it happens, how difficult it's going to be. And you find ways of, always remembering them and always assuming that they're kind of around, even though they're not. But those were difficult moments.
What is the one person who has had the greatest impact on your life?
Probably Winston Churchill, for a lot of different reasons. Too long to go into the short snapper section here.
We can come back to it.
There's a lot of good and a lot of bad about Winston Churchill. And I probably read more about him and his various exploits than about anyone else.
What is the most important lesson that you would share with other people?
Never surrender, which is kind of a never give up, kind of a Churchillian line. That's actually Churchill there on top of my head, that picture that he signed.
Oh.
One of my prized possessions. But I guess that wouldn't make a lot of sense for people who were listening to this podcast.
That's okay.
Viewing it, but there's a picture, on the wall behind me. This whole idea of not giving up, it can be translated into so many things. Obviously, with Churchill, you think in terms of the warriors, but for the rest of us, it's about, if you have a dream, if you have a focus, there's something you're trying to achieve, don't give up. Keep going, keep pushing. If you got time for a quick anecdote, I can tell you one
Sure.
on that.
Yeah.
I can remember meeting this Indigenous leader in northern Manitoba. I started my work in the late 60s in northern Manitoba as a broadcaster. And I was doing a particular story. I can't even remember which one it was. But as a result, I was traveling to a reserve and doing a bunch of interviews. And at one point after the interviews were done, I was talking to one of the elders. And, I talked to him, what's the secret of life for you? Like, what is it? And to him it was, and he translated it to basically, never give up. He said, a river or a creek or a stream doesn't run straight. It's kind of, bounces off the shoreline. It hits a tree, it hits a rock, whatever, and moves back and then moves forward. And that's like life. Things don't go absolutely perfectly straight all the time. But you got to keep focused on what you're doing and don't give up, because eventually you can move forward. And I never forgot that, because, people sort of look at my career and they say, wow, boy, everything worked for him so easily. Well, it wasn't easy. It was a lot of hard work, and there were setbacks. But I always remember that story about not giving up and stay focused on your goal, and eventually you'll learn enough to achieve it.
Great story. What do you think people would be most surprised to learn about you?
That I didn't finish high school. There's sort of this assumption in today's world, and for good reason, that people progress through school and then end up going to college or university, and then eventually end up into a particular profession. In my case, I didn't work hard enough at school. I couldn't wait to get out of school, and I left school before I, in those days, got my senior matriculation, Ontario, school in Ottawa, and off I went and joined the Navy, and things didn't get that much better when I was in the Navy either. And it wasn't until this day in Churchill, Manitoba, where I ended up with the CBC that things started to go much better. But it once again proved, I don't brag about the fact that I didn't finish high school. I certainly wouldn't encourage it to anybody else. But in my case, I still managed to make something out of my life in spite of that drawback. Now, I've tried to make up for that since. I have 13 honorary degrees.
I know.
I figure 13 honorary degrees. Surely I can trade 13 honoraries for one real one. Nobody's taken that up yet.
Yeah. You've more than earned your education in so many other ways. What's your secret talent?
A secret talent. I am lucky. I'm a lucky guy. I mean, do you know how I got into this business, Mark?
Yes. Well, I want to come to that story actually, because the first few times I heard this story, I thought it was one of those kind of, urban legends. So let's come back to that. But
okay,
it starts with luck. There's no question about that. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I've been very lucky throughout my life with the people I've met, people I've associated with, people who've helped me, and in some cases, the people I've helped. And so some of that's luck, and some of it's getting the opportunity to be with the right people.
What is your boldest prediction for the future?
That Canada will find its desired place in the world. We're never going to be a superpower, but we're a respected power. But we still have things to achieve. And I think that's one of the highlights of this book. There are some remarkable people in this book. I know we'll get to that in a moment. But what they do is they underline, in some ways, in spite of being inspiring and courageous and determined, they also underline in some ways that we're not done yet in terms of making our country the country we want it to be. And but I'm confident that in fact we will get there.
I like that. We're not done yet, because I think there's lots of opportunity for Canada going forward.
Right.
You've given lots of commencement address kind of speeches. You've spoken to lots of students. If you were giving a speech like that today, what would be your message?
Well, it's kind of a tired old phrase about how, you are the leaders of the future as you're looking out on the group of students who are graduating on any particular day. But man, this next group are really going to have to rebuild a world that has kind of collapsed in so many ways in the last year. Collapsed in some ways and advanced in other ways into new ways of doing things that we never dreamt of before the pandemic. But this next generation is going to have to make something out of that. And they are challenged in ways that none of us could ever have imagined. I mean, our son is in his fourth year at U of T. And he's doing, he'll do very well and he'll graduate in the spring of next year, 2021. But he hasn't been in class or even on campus at the U of T since last March. Now, that's not the kind of final year he was expecting or wanted or had been dreaming of and had had felt that this was going to put the finishing touches on this landscape of William Mansbridge as he heads off into a big and wider world. It's going to be very different out there. And he and the thousands of other students who are going to graduate this year, both at U of T and then across the tens of thousands who will graduate across the country, are going to be faced with this new challenge of, in many ways, remaking the country in different ways than we would have thought of even a year ago. So I would be kind of saying that to them, yet at the same time talking to them about how much confidence we have in that as the generation that has worked its way through this situation, just as our forefathers and foremothers and did, 100 years ago, coming out of A, the First World War, and B, the Spanish flu. And it led to initially some of our best years as a country. So we got caught up in yet another situation, but then the whole boom started again in the 50s. But there is a potential here for rapid growth, but growth in ways that we had not even contemplated a year ago.
Yeah, and I feel badly for people like you and me. This pandemic is interrupting, the kind of activity that we have every year at this stage of our lives. For students, it's interrupting pivotal moments in their lives. You only have grade 12 once. You only have fourth year of university once, and that's going to be a totally different experience, for these kids, where most of the things that I was going to do this year, I can do next year or the year after, but you can't do grade 12 later.
No, you're exactly right. I mean, the Will's experience was not getting that fourth year at U of T in the way he dreamt of getting it is equal by my granddaughter's situation in Winnipeg, who is in first year university. Now, she had spent her whole high school dreaming of getting into a chemical engineering department to take Chem-Eng in university. And she was offered scholarships in different universities across Canada. She ended up getting a scholarship to go to the University of Ottawa. She's still in Winnipeg because they won't let her out and they won't let her in, right? But she's taking all these classes by, remote classes, just like all her fellow classmates. But that is not the experience that she'd been waiting for. And, taking a course in chemical engineering in your bedroom
doesn't work.
Is not that wasn't the dream, right?
Yeah.
So these kids, man, I'm sure at the beginning many of them thought, "Oh, this is great. I'm not going to have to go. I'm going to have to go to class for a week or two." Well, here we are, 40 weeks later, whatever it is, and that's not the way. That was not the deal they made.
Mm-hmm. What's been a recent epiphany for you? Is there anything that you've learned recently or something you've changed your mind about?
I'm sort of constantly rethinking things and learning new things. Like a year ago, I didn't really think about doing a podcast, or given especially my background in, daily news and hard news. And to learn that I could actually just sit back and kind of relax and do a daily podcast, Monday to Friday anyway, and just sort of talk about what was on my mind, as opposed to being in this straitjacket of just the facts, man, just the facts, which we need. We need more now than ever in terms of our news services. But the whole podcasting experience has been fun. It's been liberating, as I'm sure you feel as well. And that's really opened my eyes to a whole nother side, not only of broadcasting / podcasting, but of me that I didn't realize that I had. And it's gone through change, this podcast that I do. I mean, it started off like a cheap newscast. Now Oh, it's just kind of a what am I thinking today kind of
That's great.
podcast.
Yeah,
Fun, yeah.
good for you. We're going to talk about your book coming up, but is there a book that you're most likely to recommend to other people? A book that's had a big impact on you?
Uh, well, if you're going to sort of late, I mean, I'm a big history guy. I love history, and I love especially history of both the two world wars. I'm a history buff about the Afghan War, but I'm especially a history buff about Canada's Arctic and the various voyages that opened up our Arctic, the fateful ones like the Franklin expedition, and how that changed the whole nature of Canada. So I just finished reading a book called Dead Reckoning.
Dead Reckoning?
Dead Reckoning, which is basically by McGugan. It's basically a history of all the different voyages that actually led up to finally getting through the Northwest Passage. And it is an incredible story about, we tend to hear about all the famous European explorers who opened up eventually the Northwest Passage. But in fact, it never would have happened if it hadn't been for indigenous help to all of these different expeditions. At least the ones that were successful. The ones that weren't, like Franklin, were the ones who rejected indigenous help, and that's probably why they all ended up dying, starving to death, and cannibalizing each other in some cases at the end. Now, I've been through the Northwest Passage, and I've been to those areas where those guys died, and so it's kind of personal for me. But I think it's a great story and easily one that kids, young Canadian kids and older Canadians can get into, because it also tells a story about us, about who we are, what our country is.
Peter, it's been great hearing your answers to these questions. We're going to talk about your book and more about your life in just a moment. We will start digging deep with Peter Mansbridge. We're just going to take a quick break so I can tell you a little bit more about the presenting sponsor of Digging Deep, ZenBooks. ZenBooks is Canada's go-to cloud accounting firm. They are not your typical accounting firm. I know the founders, Colin and Eric. I've worked with them for several years. And here's why I think you should consider working with them too. First of all, they bring a fresh, unique, modern approach to what is a very old-fashioned industry. These guys were working remotely and in the cloud long before it became cool. ZenBooks also uses technology to your advantage. I think this is really important. They give you the tools and analysis you need to monitor your business in real time. That's so valuable right now when everything changes so quickly. Yes, they're a virtual accounting firm, but that doesn't mean they're offshore, and it doesn't mean they're inattentive. ZenBooks combines the efficiency and effectiveness of a cloud accounting service with all the benefits that you'd want from a trusted advisor, high-level advice, and strategic support. Now, here's what I think is going to happen if you work with ZenBooks. You'll probably start out taking advantage of their cutting-edge cloud accounting solutions, but in the long run, I think you'll stay with them because of their strategic guidance and problem solving. Among their core values, they specifically list being candid and proactive. Isn't that exactly what you want from a trusted advisor? Look, even if you're already working with an accountant or a bookkeeper, or you have some accounting staff on your team, I think you should still talk to ZenBooks and learn more about their tools and their expertise. Check out ZenBooks at zenbooks.ca. That's zenbooks.ca. Digging Deep is all about helping you make better decisions, and so is Abacus Data. Most leaders struggle to connect with and engage their audiences. Why is that? It's because they aren't sure how they think and feel, and how they will react. Abacus data can give you the strategic insights you need to make better decisions and to make them confidently. Here's a good example. A major national union was recently negotiating a new agreement for its thousands of members. This had the potential to be a very difficult process. There were many competing interests. So they brought in Abacus data to conduct thorough and detailed research of their members to learn exactly where they stood, what they were thinking, what they wanted. And as a result, they were able to secure a strong new deal that was accepted overwhelmingly in a national vote. Abacus data helps all of its clients understand what's really happening in the minds of their employees, clients, and stakeholders. They help them avoid costly blind spots. And they're really good at what they do. In fact, Abacus data was one of the most accurate pollsters in the 2019 Canadian federal election. Make the one decision that will improve all of your other decisions. Let Abacus data help you move forward with confidence and clarity. Go to abacusdata.ca. That's abacusdata.ca. Peter, once again, it's great to have you on Digging Deep, and you alluded to it earlier. Let's talk about the story of what happened in Churchill, Manitoba, which got you into broadcasting, because like I told you before, the first time I heard this story, I thought it was one of those kind of mythical sort of fables about, and I thought it couldn't be true, but I guess it is. So I'd love to hear the story from your perspective.
Right. It is true. At least this version is true that I'm going to tell you now, because I've heard too, like you, heard different versions of it being thrown at me. But this is what happened. I mean, as I said, I didn't finish high school. I was in the Navy for almost 2 years, and that didn't work out quite as well as I'd hoped. I'd been taking flying training. I ended up working for an airline in Winnipeg called Transair, which its roots were Manitoba, Northwestern Ontario, Saskatchewan, and then up into the Arctic. And I started in Winnipeg. They sent me then to Brandon, then to Prince Albert, Saskatchewan. This is all over a matter of weeks, months. And then they said, there's a guy in Churchill who's on holidays and we need somebody to fill in for him. So I said, sure, I'll do that for 3 weeks. And I went up to Churchill. And of course, the guy quit when he was on holidays. And so I never left. And so I was living in Churchill, which is a fascinating community, but it's not the greatest place in the world to live, or at least it wasn't then in 1968. And
it's very far north, right? I mean, it's
right on Hudson Bay. It's still in Manitoba, so it's it's not like it's in the Arctic Circle, but it gets cold and there's a lot of snow, and the nights are long in the winter. Anyway, so I was out one day at the hangar, the Transair hangar, and I was 19 or 20 years old. And I was doing my thing, which on that particular day was helping do the freight and loading baggage and stuff. When the ticket agents said, we got a chaos here at the desk. We're oversold on the flight, and we need somebody to announce the flight over the PA system so we can start moving people onto the plane. And so they asked me if I would. So I said, sure. I went over and stood at the microphone, and Transair Flight 106 for Thompson upon Winnipeg is now ready for boarding at gate 1. There only was one gate, of course, in Churchill, a small airport. But nevertheless, people start rushing for the door, except for one guy comes the other way. He comes over towards me, who's standing at the microphone in the weight room. And he says, you've got a good voice. Have you ever thought about being in radio? And I said, no, I've actually never thought about being in radio or broadcasting of any kind. He said, well, I'm the manager of the CBC Northern Service Station here in Churchill. And I've got this opening at night. I can't get anybody to take it. It's sort of spinning records on the late shift from 11 o'clock at night till 1 in the morning when the station signed off. And he said, would you be interested? I said, yeah, but I don't know anything. I've never done anything like that. He said, no, that's easy. We'll teach you. And so that night I went over, and a chap showed me how the control knobs worked on in the room where the studio was. And the next night I started. That was it. That was my training course. And I started as a part-time employee at the CBC in September of 1968, which tells you something about what the HR department was like in Churchill. They never asked a question, nothing, right? They never asked where I went to school, if I went to school, um, nothing. All they knew was that they thought my voice would work on radio. So that's how I started, and that led from there through a lot of change and a lot of learning experiences from Churchill to Winnipeg to Regina to Ottawa to some parts of time overseas in Washington and London, and then eventually back to Toronto and started anchoring. And by 20 years after that day in the Churchill Airport, I was appointed the chief correspondent and anchor of the National. So it's like a crazy story. But as I said, right when we started, luck has been there kind of on my side. Now, I do believe that, luck goes so far. You've got to, you've got to take advantage of the luck that is in front of you. But still, that's how it started.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you hadn't done a good job, it wouldn't have led to where it led. But if you hadn't met that guy in the airport, who knows what would have happened?
I'd be still there lugging bags in Churchill and probably having a great time. I mean, I had a great time in Churchill. There's a saying in Churchill, it probably still exists now, is that if you come to Churchill, you're going to fall in love with it for a lot of different reasons. And if you're not gone within 3 years, you'll never leave. And I left just before the 3-year term came up. I got this offer of a job in Winnipeg, and off I went.
Yeah. So when you talked about school not really holding your interest, that really resonated with me. I can relate to that. So, and I'm going to share this with you before I ask you a question, so you know the context for it. But I was a very good student up until grade 12. And then I lost interest in grade 13. I got bored. I went to university and I thought it would be different. And first year university was very much like grade 14. It was a lot like high school to me. Big classes though. And so you didn't even have to show up. And so I ended up dropping out in second year and I never went back. Well, I shouldn't say I never went back. I've taken courses here and there. So I don't have a university education and I barely scraped through to get my high school education. So not unlike you in that respect. Have you ever felt self-conscious about that though, that you didn't finish high school and yet you ended up in sort of the number one broadcasting job in Canada, the number one journalism job in the country?
Yeah, very much, often. And still today, even all these years later. But I can remember when things started moving for me at the CBC. I mean, you could say they started moving the day that guy came up to me at the microphone. But by the time I started proving myself as a reporter, and after picking up lots of knowledge and experience, I used to be brought down to Toronto every once in a while because they had, I guess they had their eye on me as somebody with potential for the future, and so they put me on special courses every once in a while. And I used to come down to Toronto, and I can always remember kind of coming in from Pearson Airport and thinking, is this going to be the trip where they catch up on me and realize this is all make-believe, right? What does this guy really know? But, they never did. But, as I said earlier, I don't brag about that. I mean, it's kind of a nice story and a funny story, but really it is not the route to happiness and attaining the kind of professional standards you want to. The moment I got this job at the CBC in Churchill, I knew right then and there, this is my last chance. I've had opportunities. I didn't work hard at school. I mean, at least you were still into it till grade 12. But I was in a different world before I even got to high school. But I realized at the CBC, this is a great opportunity. I'm not going to screw this up. I'm going to work really hard. And I worked, harder than anybody else in that situation at that time. I spent hours and hours on my own time, sitting on the floor of the radio station at night after I was finished work, listening to shortwave radio, which was the only way you could listen to stuff back then. It was kind of before satellite, and I, I'd listen to the way other broadcasters in other parts of the world did their thing, how they did interviews, how they talked, what they, the way they wrote. Never in the sense of copying them, but understanding that, you got to find your own path. You got to find your own way of doing things, but you learn by listening to those who already are doing it well. And so I spent a lot of time, my own time, prepping for that, and it made friends and family not very happy that I spent so much time focused on work. But I know if I hadn't, I probably never would have got to Winnipeg. And even in Winnipeg, I never would have got beyond that I was a local reporter there, and then eventually moved up to working as a reporter on the National. That I was behind the eight ball. Like I wasn't on an equal level with the others. I had to work that much harder to stay even with them, and then to eventually, in some cases, pass them. So it meant a lot of extra hard work.
Yeah, and maybe that's part of what drove you, right? Was you felt some pressure to make up for that, right? And to make the most of the opportunity. But I understand as well that you've always had kind of a fascination with things. You talked about your love of history. You've always kind of been fascinated and curious by things, which of course is a great quality in a journalist and a broadcaster, right?
When I'm asked to teach at journalism schools or guest lecture or what have you, I always actually use that idea, Mark. I say to them, if you want to be a journalist, you almost have to be born with three things. First of all, before you learn anything, you've got to be curious. You got to be fascinated about what's going on around you. That's one. Two, you've got to be fascinated and curious and interested enough to ask questions of those who understand what's going on so you can learn. And third, you have to have the ability in some form to communicate what you're hearing to others who are equally interested. So those are kind of the basics. And if you don't have those, and I've known, you've probably seen as well, I've seen people come into newsrooms with journalism degrees who didn't have those three things. And I could tell they're not going to make it. They're going to, they're not bad people. They're smart people, but this isn't the job for them. It may be somewhere else, maybe in sales, it may be in marketing, it may be in communications of some other area, but it's not this area because they didn't have those basics. So you're absolutely right. Curiosity is like one of the initial things you gotta have.
Yeah. So let's talk about the book, because I think this is a natural place to kind of bring it into the discussion. And you've interviewed everyone from Olympic athletes to Barack Obama to every prime minister of this country in the last 50 years. And
I'm glad you added that. I thought you were going to say, I remember that interview you did with Sir John A. Macdonald.
Not quite that far back. But you chose in this book to talk about the stories of some very some Canadians who are not very famous, right? So there's a couple of people in the book who have some profile, like Matt Devlin, the play-by-play announcer for the Raptors, and you happen to be wearing some Raptors swag today. Yeah,
We the North.
Yeah, but there are a lot of people in there, and I actually found it when I received a copy of the book, and I flipped through it. I was surprised initially that I didn't recognize more of the names, but that was a deliberate choice on your part. So, tell me a little bit about that.
Absolutely, it was deliberate, and here's why. Because exactly as you said, I've spent my career interviewing, for the most part, well-known people. Celebrities, whether they were in, prime ministers or presidents, whether they're in politics, whether they're in sports, entertainment, you name it. I've met a lot of the greats and benefited from having met them, and certainly glad I did. But there is a certain predictability to many of those interviews, because in many cases they've been interviewed many times before. They're not going to surprise them. You're trying to surprise them. You're trying to get them to react in a way like, boy, I've never heard that question before. But in most cases, many of them have. So I'm not saying I've wasted my time on those interviews. I'm glad I did them. But the interviews that I tend to remember most were people who had never been interviewed before, who were quite remarkable in some fashion about the reason I was sitting across from them, because they've been caught in some extraordinary circumstance. So when Mark Bulgach, who was my co-author, and I sat down and started, okay, who are we going to talk to? I used that example, and he totally bought into it. And he said, "You're right. Let's find these people who we know are out there, who are extraordinary in their lives, and have done wonderful things either for themselves or their family, their community, their country, but nobody knows about them. Let's go that route." And that's what we did. So that was the kind of the genesis of it. I mean, it was initially Simon and Schuster's idea, the publisher. They were thinking it was some kind of a book along the lines of kind of hometown heroes. And we liked that, but we turned it into Extraordinary Canadians, because we were looking for that kind of level of interest and profile on people. And we wanted to ensure that the book was reflective of the whole country, that it was diverse not only in geography, but in gender and in culture and in profession. The sameness in it is in the fact that so many of these people faced huge challenges. In some cases, challenges of an instant. In other cases, challenges of a life. And it was how they responded to those challenges that becomes the central part of, and the inspiring part of the book.
It's very inspiring, and I'm really glad you did that, because I think there is a bit of a phenomenon that that if you want to call it the riches of exposure, the benefits of exposure, are disproportionately awarded to a small number of people typically, right? So, and I mean, you've experienced this, I've experienced it. You get, you've won awards and you've gotten these honorary degrees, and I'm not saying you don't deserve those, but there's people who achieve a certain status in our country or in a community, get that reinforced upon them over and over again. And then there are other people who work hard every day and volunteer at the food bank or lead some not-for-profit organization, and they never get any of that. And you've drawn attention to these people, which I think is really powerful.
Well, you put that in a really good way, because it's so true on a number of levels. First of all, none of these people called us up and said, "Hey, I'm an extraordinary Canadian. I want you to tell my story." In fact, most of them, when we called them, we go, no, you've got the wrong person. I'm just a gal. I'm just a guy who's done a few things, but nothing special about me. And we said, no. We think you're extraordinary. We want to understand where that comes from. So we want to tell your story. But the point is, none of them came rushing looking for publicity. The other point is, and you struck on it really well there, I've received more awards than I deserve, I'm sure. But I remember when I received the Order of Canada in 2008, which was a humbling experience. There are kind of three levels to an Order of Canada. It's a companion, which is sort of like the really top level, and then there's the officer, and then the member. I'm middle there as an officer. And the ceremony's at Government House, and the Governor General's there, and it's a lot of pomp and circumstance. I got to tell you, I wasn't ready for it. I was honored to receive the award, but I thought, okay, I'm gonna go there. It's special, and I'll get this medal, and then I'll move on with my life. Well, I get in there, and you're in Rideau Hall, and they read each citation out for each person. And I'm sitting there next to a couple of people who I happen to know, Frank McKenna, the former premier of New Brunswick, a couple of other political figures. But the majority of people in that room who were getting the Order of Canada that day, I'd never heard of it, never seen before, never met. They started reading their stories, and it's exactly like the way you just said. There's so-and-so from a small town, southern Alberta, and they were responsible for some form of charitable organization, or they were a key person within the hospital, or what have you. They've done a lot of different things in their towns or their communities. And the more they read these stories of these people, they each came up to get their honor, the more uncomfortable some of us felt, as we're going, what are we doing here? Like, I'm just a broadcaster, right? Or I'm just a cabinet minister. These people are like the real salt and earth of this country. They're the ones who really, really make a difference. So when I say it was a humbling experience, it was on a personal level, but it was on a much bigger level because of witnessing that and realizing what really makes this country good.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, I love that. Yeah, and it is humbling, I think, to see. I'm always amazed, and I've gotten to volunteer on different boards and that sort of thing, and people always express gratitude for the couple of hours a month you put in and that sort of thing. And I always think the people who really deserve the gratitude are the people who work in these agencies day in and day out. They make less money than they would if they were doing something else. They pour their lives every day, 9, 10, 11, 12 hours a day into whatever it is that the cause of this organization is. And I get to, come along once a month and be at a board meeting, but they're saying thank you to me. And it really should be the other way around.
Right.
Let's talk about a couple of the people that you look at in the book. There's a woman named Janice Eisenhower, who, and you mentioned earlier how fascinated you've been with the war in Afghanistan, and she obviously, just tell a little bit about her connection to Afghanistan and how she.
Yeah. I just to. I don't want to tell all these stories, if you know what I mean. I don't want to give away everything.
Yeah.
But I can certainly give you the reason why we focused on her. Janice is she's from Calgary. She's one of those people who, like many of us, would say, in 1998, I couldn't have even pointed to Afghanistan on a map. And sadly, many of us today probably couldn't find Afghanistan on a map, unless it was clearly labeled. But she suddenly got interested in the Afghan story, partly because of reading the work of another terrific journalist, Sally Armstrong. You may have met over time. If not, you want to get her on this podcast, but she's amazing. Anyway, Sally had written about Afghanistan and the trouble in the 1990s that women were having growing up, women and girls living and growing up under the Taliban government. And she was quite moved by it and started thinking, and she was young. She was, I think she was still in high school at that point, but certainly in university. That what can I do to make a difference for those young girls? So that's where it started. That was the sort of the beginning of the thread that took Janice from an idea of how to help to now one of the most successful international organizations in helping women in Afghanistan. It's an incredible story. I mean, she basically started all off after hearing stories from Sally on her own. And the pathway she takes and the experiences she has, which are detailed in the profile on her, are once again stories of courage and determination and resilience and the belief that we can do better. And we care. As Canadians, we care to make things better for others. So it's hers is a great story.
There's another great story. I mean, there's many great stories in the book, but you share the story. And by the way, people should know you tell these stories in the first person, which I find really interesting and really powerful. It's it's not you writing about these individuals. It's you letting their voices be heard, which I think is really
Yeah, that
really,
was give full credit to Sarah St. Pierre, who's the editor at Simon and Schuster. She suggested to Mark and I, why don't you think about this, doing these in their voice? Because obviously we interviewed all of these people many times, and we had transcripts of everything they said, and quite easily we could have turned it into us telling their story. But it was in some ways even easier to turn it into them telling their stories. Obviously, we had to edit and we had to maneuver things around and move this chunk to there and all that to make it to have a nice story flow to it. But it is in their voice, and it's amazing the number of people like you, Mark, who have said to me, "I found this so much more engaging and so much more kind of direct that it's made me wonder." Like, uh-oh, did we just write ourselves out of a job here?
Yeah, you're just the middleman now, Peter.
That's right.
Yeah. But one of the other people you talk about is someone I know pretty well, Rabbi Reuven Bolka. And many people outside Ottawa would not know him as well unless they knew that he was the guy they saw delivering every year as the chaplain of the Canadian Armed Forces, one of the dedications at the Remembrance Day ceremonies. And
sure.
He's given some really, really powerful speeches that stand out in my memory. And he also has, as you uncovered, a really fascinating backstory too. So just an incredible, he wasn't born in Canada, and he came here and he's become a huge contributor to this country. And it's another great Canadian story.
You've captured it all there, and that's for sure. And the beauty of the rabbi story is the way we came up with it. It was Mark, actually, especially, who came up with it. We do, as many news organizations do, CBC does Remembrance Day every year. And Mark, I'd host it. On many occasions, Mark was always the executive producer of the special broadcast on November 11th. And when we were sitting there at first thinking through, who could we talk to? Who should we check out for this book? And he said, when we do Remembrance Day, there's that one guy who every year kind of astounds us with the message he has, that he speaks to Canadians about. And I wonder what his story is. Why don't we go to the rabbi's background, his personal history. And sure enough, that history traces from some of the camps in the Holocaust years through the U.S. to Canada, with many stops in between. And it is a remarkable story, and it was all started by, Mark especially sitting in the truck, satellite truck, on Remembrance Day going, who is that guy? We see him every year. He must have a great story. Well, yeah, he has an extraordinary story. And we tell it in this book.
That's great. I have a vivid memory of him giving a speech one year where he talked about how we don't just support our troops, we love our troops. And he kept saying that phrase over and over again, and it has really stuck with me. And it was during the height of the Afghan war, I think that he probably delivered that message.
Right.
Now, shifting gears a little bit, I know you've told these great stories of extraordinary but perhaps unknown Canadians. From all of the other more famous people that you've interviewed over the course of your long career, are there any of those interviews that stand out for you?
Of the famous people?
Yeah.
Well, listen, I mean, it was when I walked into the White House in February of 2009, it was a month almost to the day since Barack Obama had was inaugurated as the president of the United States. And I had, I found him fascinating since the first time that I watched him speak at a Democratic convention. I think it was in 2004. And I thought, I gotta get an interview with this guy. And he ended up going into the U.S. Senate, tried then, he wouldn't do it. During the election campaign, he wouldn't do it. Not surprisingly. I mean, focus on foreign interviews at a time like that. But then he won. And so during the transition period, I tried to get him again through David Axelrod, who's become a friend. He was just on my podcast this week. But they wouldn't do it. They said, call us when everything's done. So, of course, I was down there for the inauguration, and I went over to the White House either that afternoon or the next morning. I can't remember now, just to make sure they still had that request. And they did. And then suddenly I got a call saying, if you can be at the White House, I was back in Canada, if you can be at the White House by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, you get 15 minutes with President Obama. Now, that was a big deal, right? It was a big deal for me. It was a big deal for the CBC. Believe it or not, we'd never had a kind of one-on-one, face-to-face interview with the President of the United States in the history of the CBC. So here we were. I was sitting there, a baggage handler from Churchill, sitting in the White House, across from, in that moment, the biggest rock star in the world, right? And having an interview, and he was great. We didn't break any kind of major news, although I did at one point say to him, "Is the war in Afghanistan winnable?" And he did not answer in the affirmative. He didn't answer in the negative either, but he didn't answer in the affirmative, which was telling in itself. Anyway, that was huge, right? That was a big deal for me. I'll never forget that moment. But, so was interviewing Brian Wilson from the Beach Boys. I mean, I'd grown up, before I was a Beatles fan, I was a Beach Boys fan. It kind of broke the year before the Beatles. And Brian Wilson was the mastermind of that band. Crazy guy. It was a crazy interview because I was trying to fill a half-hour show, and he thought he had agreed to a 1-minute interview. So he gave those he made those answers we gave in the short snapper section earlier look like long answers. So I thought, oh my gosh, because it was live to tape, and I thought, oh, how am I ever going to get a half an hour out of this? But eventually, and that was where you have to work as an interviewer. You know this. If you don't have, the cooperation you kind of need in an interview, it's a two-person thing. You've got to work really hard to make it happen. And so I did, and it turned out to be one of my favorite interviews. So, that was good. But, all of them, Desmond Tutu, the various different leaders of religious faiths who I've sat across, because I wouldn't say I'm a religious person, but I'm fascinated by their ability to talk about why it's important. And so the Aga Khan, just the Dalai Lama, all these people. And in every one of those occasions, you're sitting there across from them, you're going, really? This is like a high school dropout baggage handler guy from Churchill. Look who I'm sitting with today. Anyway, those were all.
Yeah, that's amazing. It's interesting to me that you still, there are, I think there are people who would forget kind of where they came from, but you still, it sounds like you still sort of had that reality check with you your whole career, even as you did these amazing things and accomplished all these great accomplishments.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that would be another one of those sayings that you want to keep at the forefront of your mind, is to never forget where you came from and how you got to where you were, and who helped you get there. Because obviously I didn't do all these things on my own. I stood on a lot of shoulders um, of others who wanted to help me to get to where I was, and to interview the men and women and different walks of life that I had the opportunity to talk to. Um, I still do recall the fact that I will often be sitting there in some kind of a situation and going, "This really is remarkable that I'm here," because it could so easily have gone a different way. Now, I'm basically a lucky guy. If that hadn't happened in Churchill that day in the airport, maybe something else would have happened.
Yeah.
I would have become a rocket scientist or an NHL star, or
Yeah. Or an underwater archaeologist.
Exactly. I should have kept pursuing that.
Yeah. So what did you, I think of, in a way, your education, which was probably a richer education than you could have ever gotten from a university, was all these conversations you had with these people, right? And what did you learn from all of that? What are, how did that shape your life, getting the exposure to all these people?
Well, I think you're right about that. I mean, having that opportunity uh, is rich, like a couple of years in university. There's no question about that. Having that opportunity, not only to talk and listen to people, but to ask them anything that I wanted to ask them, which is a great luxury when you're an interviewer. You've got somebody sitting across from you, or at the other end of a Zoom line, we do these days, who is kind of totally at your whatever your will is at that point in terms of talking to them. And you're asking questions, and hopefully they're going to answer them, and hopefully you'll pursue to attempt to get the answers that you're looking for. So it is it's a great spot to be in, and it is an incredible learning experience. I mean, one learns from every one of these kind of situations. I feel sorry for you. You sat there for an hour and you're going, I haven't learned anything that I didn't know already.
That's not true. This has been great. But are there any lessons that stand out for you? Any perspectives you gained, or anything that sort of changed your mind about something when you were sitting across from some of the great people you interviewed, famous or otherwise?
Well, I mean, I always go back to that native leader, the indigenous leader in northern Manitoba. It's so simple in its description, and yet so powerful in understanding and accepting that as normal. But in all these, in so many of these others, whether it was Obama or Tutu or, it could be any of them that were sitting there, and you understand in the moment that you're dealing with somebody who is having to make big decisions on the part of many that can affect the lives of millions. And you're looking at them trying to understand, okay, what is leadership? What is the secret of leadership? How do you judge these people in terms of their merits as leader? Everything's changed because of the last 4 years and watching the kind of clown show that's been going on in Washington. When you get around to this description of leaders, the impact they can have. But I got the opportunity to sit across from a lot of people who are in, powerful positions of leadership, whether they were political figures like Margaret Thatcher, or business leaders, or sports leaders, or entertainment leaders. And they have all impacted, the way we live still to this day, even those are gone. And sitting there across from them, you're looking for what's the secret of leadership. Is the secret of leadership listening to others? Is it secret not listening to others. Everybody's different, but in each case, you're kind of learning things about how they maneuver the difficult decisions that they're making, every day.
Do you worry about the future of the news business and journalism with everything that's been going on? I mean, the job you had in a way, anchoring the nightly news, it's almost like the in the job that newspapers have had in our society. It's changing so rapidly. And one of the things that I've come to realize is we think of that as a pillar of democracy and a free society, and I think it's an essential ingredient. But if you go back through history, it wasn't always there, and so therefore it is possible to imagine it not being there in the future. And that's one of the things I worry about. What are your thoughts on that?
It's a good reason to worry about it. I mean, obviously, when it wasn't there, neither was most of the world, neither was democracy. Um, so having it now and understanding what it's meant along those terms and why it's an important pillar, not the only pillar, but a very important pillar. Um, it also reflects on the media of today in terms of the relationship it has with the public. Now, I worry a lot about the media's role in today's world and how it's conducting itself. I mean, the first thing you have to accept is the media is not a monolith. The different news organizations operate differently and have different standards. And so it's up to the public to choose who they trust, who they believe, who to them is telling the truth, because truth matters. It's, in fact, in my view, it's all that matters. And truth is under attack, as we all know. I don't need to dwell on that. But at the same time, I can dwell on the fact that the media in general has lost some of the trust factor that it had earned from the public. Now, they're not alone in that. A lot of professions have lost the trust of the public, and for good reason. But the media has gone through this rapid expansion over the last 15 or 20 years. There was the 500 channel universe, and then the internet, and then satellites and streaming, and cable news, and all of this is all sort of crunched in a very short period of time, and people are going, whoa, I'm not sure who to watch, what to believe, what I should read, who I should listen to. I mean, take television, for example. When I became the anchor at the National in the 80s, if you went out on the street in any major city in the U.S. and said, there are three major networks in this country, who are the anchors of the evening news on those three networks? And you'd probably get a high response rate of, Jennings, Brokaw, Rather.
Yeah.
You go out today and say, of the three major networks, and they'd say, what do you mean three? There's like 103. But if you reduced it to just tell us of the three, ABC, NBC, CBS, who are the anchors? And I bet you most people couldn't tell you all three.
I'm not sure I could tell you all three,
changed.
Peter. And
yeah.
I'm in the news business. I couldn't.
Right.
I'm not sure. There's a new guy at ABC. I don't even know who that is anymore. Yeah.
He's been new for like 5 years.
Has he? Okay.
Yeah, but listen, I'm not making fun of you. I think most people are in that same kind of situation. And part of that, I mean, who was the most trusted American? It was Walter Cronkite in the 60s and the 70s. You don't hear that term used anymore to talk about a news person. And that's, unfortunate, to say the least. But this trust issue is a big deal. When you look at the numbers, just talk about journalists. Journalists have gone down, slid down those rankings of trust factor considerably. So, as I said, other professions. But when you're down approaching where, we used to make fun of used car salesmen. They don't even call themselves that anymore. They're smart. They're now called previously owned salespeople.
Yes.
Sounds much more distinguished. and it probably is. But they're kind of still roughly where they were. Well, we've gone down. Everybody's gone down except doctors, nurses, and frontline healthcare workers, and not just because of the pandemic. That was the case beforehand. They've always been near the top. Well, they haven't suffered. Journalists, politicians, business leaders, they've all suffered. And journalists have to be worried about that. They've got to be focused on trying to get that trust factor back. And part of doing that is to be much more transparent in the way they do their job. They got to explain how they make decisions about what's news and what isn't news. Why they grant, an anonymous factor to some sources and not to others. They've got to do a lot more explaining as to how they do their work, or that number will keep going down. And the further down it goes, democracy is impacted, and so is their future. We can't let that happen.
I'm conscious of the time, Peter. Do you have time for like one more question? Is that okay?
A one more Mark Sutcliffe question? So,
Yes.
so only 20 minutes to go now? No. Fire away. Ask
Okay.
another one.
I just wanted to finish by asking if it's true. Something that I read about you is that you've kept keepsakes and souvenirs and mementos from all of your travels around the world. Is that true?
It is true. And some of them are in this very room that I'm speaking to you from. I kept soil from the beach at Juno Beach in Normandy, where the Canadians landed on June 6, 1944. I've got soil from Vimy Ridge, famous battle in April of 1917. Almost 4,000 Canadians died there. My grandfather was in that battle. I've got a stone from Great Wall of China. I've got a piece of the wall in Berlin. I was there with Mark Bulgutch, my co-author. I was with Mark there that weekend the wall came down. So, there's a lot of things like that. Some of them I've built into our fireplace here in Stratford. And others I just have kind of sitting around here in my office. I talked about exploring the Northwest Passage and going to the areas where some of the crew of the Franklin ships, the Erebus and the Terror, perished. There was an archaeological dig. This is as close as I've got to underwater archaeology. There was an archaeological dig going on there the day I arrived with two archaeologists from Nunavut. Were there, and I came in on a chopper, and they were showing me what they were doing, and they said, you should look for stuff here. And I said, well, I'm not gonna. I wouldn't know what to look for. And they said, no, just look, just be careful about what you touch. And the next thing I knew, I saw this thing that looked like a little piece of a bone, but I started to pull it out of where it was, and it turned out it wasn't a bone. It was a toothbrush. And it turned out to be, after they did the examination of it, a toothbrush of one of the men from the Franklin expedition. Now, they took it away. They grabbed it. It was a big deal for them. It was a big find. They found a few nails and stuff like that. But they grabbed this toothbrush, and it became a big thing for them. And it's now on the exhibit that tours the country of the Franklin relics. And what they made a 3D replica of that toothbrush. It's unbelievable how exact it is. And presented it to me, and it's on that shelf behind me over there.
Wow.
So those are like some of the things. I've got lots of little things here and there, but they're all. There you can see. Your listeners can't see, but you can see, Mark. That's me and Obama in the White House.
Yeah.
And that's a big deal for me to have that picture and that moment. And it was, obviously that'll be a day I'll never forget.
Well, Peter, this has been such an interesting conversation, and I want to congratulate you on the book. I encourage everyone to check it out. There are some amazing stories in there, and they've got such an energy to them because, as you described, you share them in the first person. There's just such a great voice to them. And for me, this has been a real delight because I'm sitting here thinking, look at me, this university dropout, and I got to just spend an hour with Peter Mansbridge. So I'm thrilled and delighted.
The high school dropout.
That's right.
Yeah, we're great examples, aren't we?
Yeah. By the way, I always tell everyone, do not follow my example. Go to university, finish university. I was lucky, and I'm an exception, not the rule. But this has been a real pleasure. I'm very grateful for your time, and again, congratulations on the book.
Thanks, Mark. I really enjoyed having this chat, and I appreciate any opportunities to let listeners know that they should go get this book.
Right on. I have to tell you, it was a real delight getting to speak with Peter Mansbridge after watching him for so many years. I was very excited to have a chance to talk with him one-on-one. And I highly encourage you to check out his new book, Extraordinary Canadians. There are some terrific stories in there that will really boost your faith in the human spirit. I like what Peter said, by the way, about how moving forward doesn't always have to happen in a straight line. That is so true. So once again, thank you to Peter Mansbridge for joining us on Digging Deep. If you enjoyed this episode, please review it and share it with others. That is going to help us produce more great episodes. And if you want to keep digging deep into topics and lessons like this, or see the show notes about this episode, or subscribe to our weekly newsletter, or read my blog, you can do all of that at letsdigdeep.com. That is letsdigdeep.com. Thank you for listening.